All right. It's Wednesday, 1 p.m. Eastern time. I am really, really excited today. So excited. I wore my nerdiest shirt that I have, my NASA shirt. I have special guest Nick Pietrangelo of Power by Sun. And Nick is a good, dear friend of mine who I met just a couple months ago, but we have become great friends. And Nick taught me all about solar energy, and now he's teaching me about hydrogen fuel cells. And then we also have Van Doan, who is just volunteering as an intern for my company, SolisMatica. We do business intelligence and data analytics for all kinds of companies. And so she's joining me today. We're trying to keep Nick in check because Nick, we found, is he's very knowledgeable about fuel cells, and he'll get going. And every once in a while, we got to reel him back. So Nick, let's start with a quick introduction by you, because from what I know, you've been in the commercial fishing industry, you've been in anesthesiology, you've dabbled in battery manufacturing, and then now you've been researching fuel cells, solar, renewables. And, just kind of give us an idea of your journey and how you got to this point with your knowledge of fuel cells.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as I can, but it's pretty extensive. The title is, excuse me, doctor. I'm a medical doctor with 46 years of experience in medicine, primarily anesthesia. I was the founder of a solar company, excuse me, called Power by Sun. That was about 35 years ago, and also a founder of a battery company called Harding Energy about 35 years ago. So these were gone concurrently with the anesthesia practice. Obviously, it wasn't me alone. It was a lot of people, wonderful partners, and took a long time to evolve, but it's evolved. And at the present tense, which we'll talk about today, this is all coming to surface. Clean, green energy, excuse me again, batteries, fuel cells. Now, how I got into fuel cells, I spent a lot of time with a company called Energy Conversion Devices. That was Stanford Oshinsky, and I'll reference him later on. And Robert Stempel, who used to be the former president of General Motors. And they had the whole hydrogen economy figured out, from the solar cell supplying the electricity to go to the electrolysis unit to supply the hydrogen, which then goes into hydride storage. That's a solid hydrogen storage, not gaseous. And I'll say more on that later, which then, when released, goes through the fuel cell, the hydrogen fuel cell, and then the process is a total circle. So it starts at the sun, goes through the water, and produces energy. So that's where everything was interconnected. And in today's present world, energy conversion devices does not exist. There are its pieces of technology all throughout the world in different companies, but we don't have to get into that. But at this particular point, Nikola truck, which is a recent introduction into the stock market a couple of months ago, has taken the same idea of the solar hydrogen route, hydrogen to power heavy duty trucks through a fuel cell. So
wow. Yeah,
this is all connected. It may sound like it's not connected, but it's all connected, and it's very, very, very complex.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me, and it's very complex, like you said. So we're going to try to moderate and keep it grounded for the audience. So we may ask you some clarifying questions as we go along the way. But I wanted to show everybody kind of something. So I host a Lego League team, and then when in the off season, I teach the kids about new technologies. And it was before I met you, Nick. I heard about fuel cells, and I heard that there were kits out there to teach the kids about fuel cells. So what's interesting is this whole kit made by Horizon Electric. So I'm going to show this on here. So these guys, Horizon Educational, makes this kit, and it comes with a solar panel too. So you could hook that up too. But what's really interesting is, let me go back to this screen. So, this, before I bought this, I had a hard time conceptualizing what fuel cells were and how they worked. But, when I bought this, what was really interesting was, even the kids were able to kind of understand what was going on. So they put water into these two tanks, and then they hooked up a battery to the fuel cell, and it started the electrolysis process. And then the bubbles into each of the two tanks, you see them labeled here. One is O2 and one is H. And so one is hydrogen, and there's a little capsule at the bottom. And the kids could watch the bubbles fill up the little capsules, and they could see how the hydrogen was being produced in one tank and then oxygen in the other tank, right? And then what was really cool was then they unplugged the battery, right? And then they hooked up the fuel cell and then pumped in the hydrogen and the oxygen from the electrolysis process they did. And there's an electric motor right up here in the front. And then they could watch the hydrogen and oxygen levels go down in the tanks, go into the fuel cell, which is right here. And then they could see the engine power up. And there was an LED too to indicate to the kids how it was running, right? So this was a great introduction. And I just wanted to show that, there are kits out there, if anybody's interested, to kind of, try out fuel cell technology. So we're just going to pause real quick. And if you're in the audience and you have questions for Nick about fuel cells, because Nick's probably going to go 100 miles an hour, and we're going to try to capture this, and we'll probably need to do a second show, Nick, because there's going to be a lot of information.
I agree.
Yep. But we're going to try to capture as much as we can, on this show, and then probably come back and do a second show, right? The other thing is, so let us know where you're from and if you have any questions for Nick. And also, what I wanted to bring up, Nick, and you and I have talked about this, is, during these times, a lot of us are kind of in the present, and it's kind of during COVID, we're staying at home and isolated, and it's kind of tough, right? But you and I have talked about solar energy, about renewables, about all this technology that is coming together for the future. And, I find it so uplifting that all this stuff is starting to come together to fruition, right? I read, there were some articles about Nikola, combining forces with GM. There was investment on GM to develop fuel cell trucks. And we could talk a little bit about why for trucks, it makes a little more sense, right? Because the batteries take up a lot of room, I heard, but fuel cell, the hydrogen doesn't. So the trucks have more capacity for transport. And also stuff like, I think Azure, Microsoft is testing some fuel cell, they're backing up hydrogen into their data centers, right? So, there's a lot of people working. And I even heard, I think Apple at their office, their main headquarters may use some of this too. So we'll go into all of this. But I think the big question people ask is for commercial or personal vehicles, right? There's the electric vehicle out there, and then there's fuel cell technology. And I was looking at some maps, and one of the constraints is there's not that many stations outside of California, right? I think there's 39 stations in the US. There may be one in the Northeast now, but that's one of the limitations of fuel cells for cars right now. But yeah, can you kind of give us an overview of, kind of the evolution of EV and fuel cell cars over the past, I guess it's been 5 years, right?
It goes much longer than that. So the platform then, now this can be also for buildings, but the platform I'm going to start out, which is the most prevalent now, is electric vehicles. And there is a battle royal. I have to use the word battle a little bit, but there's a big challenge between the two. And I'll start out with this, and this is at 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 feet. The sun delivers to the earth in less than a day enough energy to power the entire world for a year. So we're very well supplied with energy. And that direct conversion of that sunlight, the electromagnetic waves of the sunlight, is converted in one step by a photovoltaic cell or a solar cell. So we're going to be talking about solar hydrogen, part of this. So on the hydrogen side of the equation, 70 to 75% of the earth is water. Think of that. You split the water, you get the hydrogen, and you use the electricity from the solar cell to split the water. Now, in the universe, 93% of the universe, that's a big number, that's a big area, is hydrogen. So we're grabbing the things that are most prevalent in the universe. And of course, the sun is nothing but a big ball of very, very highly compressed hydrogen. And there's enough energy in the sun. Granted, it's 93 million miles away, but there's the equivalent of exploding multiple hydrogen bombs, 1 megawatt hydrogen bombs, 96 billion of them, energy per second from the sunlight. So I could be a little off on the number, but it's in the billions of 1 megaton hydrogen bombs per second. That's the energy that's captivated in the sun. The only trouble is it's 93 million miles away.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go, friends. So let's now come down
on the big screen. There you go. Now you're on the big screen.
So let's come down to Earth now. So the platform to bring all these technologies together for now is the electric vehicle.
Okay.
There's several types of electric vehicles. You can't use the term for everything. There's multiple definitions. There's the pure battery electric vehicle. The best example of that is the Tesla with Elon Musk. There also are others. The Nissan Leaf, there's several others beside that. Number two is the hydrogen fuel cell. Also, there's several of those companies that make hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that are in the marketplace. The most, in my examples, the best example is the Toyota Mirai fuel cell car. There's also the Kia and the Hyundai fuel cell cars, and there's others evolving. The third choice for electric vehicle is gasoline electric hybrid. And again, there's several in the world. There's a lot of them in the world. All different makers have hybrids. So that's part gasoline engine, part electric motor with a battery. The best example of that is the Toyota Prius. And in the world, there's tens of millions of Toyota Priuses. They started in Japan in the 90s. They came to the United States in about 2000. So they're all over the world. And then the other choice to that is the plug-in hybrid. So you have a hybrid, you have gasoline motor, you have a battery bank, but you can plug in the battery bank also at your home state. So there's so many different choices in the electric vehicle avenue. So that begs the question, okay, battery versus fuel cell.
Yeah.
Now on the battery side, Elon Musk is one of the principal movers of that. And of course, we're talking about competition here. So he calls the fuel cell a fool cell. So you see where he's coming from.
Yeah.
On the opposite side of that, the fuel cell, Bezos, Amazon, is very positive on fuel cells and uses fuel cells in some of their infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, a battery stores electricity by pure definition, stores electrons. The fuel cell does not store electricity. The fuel cell makes electricity if you feed it a fuel. And we will go through that in just a little bit. There happens to be one regenerative fuel cell which stores a little bit of hydrogen to get it started. That was the energy conversion device's Ovonic regenerative fuel cell. And that really hasn't gone too far. But that's the only fuel cell that stores any energy. All right, so you've got storage. So you've got, we're going to talk about fuel cells, batteries, and capacitors. And seeing I have my limitations, I am not an electrical engineer. Charles Elwood, who is leading the talk here, is an electrical engineer. I am not.
You've got 15 years of experience researching this stuff on me. So
no, I understand. But
I'm going to defer to you, and I'll just ask questions. How about that?
Okay, so capacitors I'm really not going to talk about because I don't know a whole lot about them. All I know is that they are useful and they store energy for quick bursts of energy, not for sustained energy release.
Okay.
So under the definition of batteries, they store electricity. We're going to batteries first.
Yeah.
The first type of battery is a single-use battery, the throwaway battery. That's like the mercury coin battery or the very popular alkaline battery, copper top battery. When that is extinguished, or the one with the bunny, that's the help me out here, folks. The bunny with the drum.
Energizer.
Energizer. Okay, those are alkaline single-use batteries. When they're done, you throw them away or you recycle them.
Commercials anymore.
Yeah, right. The second type is a flow battery, and that pumps the electrolyte to exchange the electrons. And that's only used in stationary applications, meaning not transportation.
Okay.
There's the sodium sulfur battery, the vanadium battery, and those batteries are only used basically in power plants.
Okay.
They did try them at one time in vehicles, and it was a disaster. So, because you're pumping a fluid in and out of the battery. And then there's the rechargeable battery, both used in the stationary application for storage of electricity and the traction or propulsion battery, which brings in the electric car. Are we doing okay, Chief?
We're good. Let me just stop. So I was trying to catch up on all of this stuff and was binge watching YouTube videos. And so I think I watched one video. A good example is a lead acid battery, right? It's contained. There's the anode and the cathode, and there's sulfuric acid that's, I believe, letting the protons go in between the two plates, but then the electrons are coming out through the wires, right? So it forces electrons. And I believe the parallel to fuel cells is you still have an anode and a cathode, but a lot of times there's a liquid coming in on the anode side or a gas in hydrogen cells. So there's a flow of a chemical, and then on the opposite side you have oxygen, right? It's kind of different than most batteries are self-contained, but fuel cells, you've got a flow of fuel coming into it. Is that kind of just hydrogen fuel cells, but nobody hears about the other fuels.
Right. And we'll go through those. Okay. But I'm going to start first with a battery.
Okay.
Different types of battery. And the battery is an electrochemical reaction. So we're going on the rechargeable battery. It stores electricity and it can be recharged. The first battery ever, now that not rechargeable, but just the concept of battery, dissimilar metals holding an electrical charge, was from Volta and Galvani many, many years ago, 600, 700 years ago. That was really the first battery.
Yeah.
Secondly, the first rechargeable battery was in France, Jacques Planté, and that was over 150 years ago. That's the lead acid battery.
Yeah.
And it's very, very interesting. Even now, 2020, the lead acid battery is still very, very, very prevalent in our society.
Yeah. Right.
It is used in transportation, not to drive the car, but it's used in what is called a soft hybrid. That's when the engine shuts off at a stoplight or a stop sign, or when it's not moving. And then to restart the car when the light turns green, the electricity comes from a lead acid battery, even in 2020, 2021. And of course, the standard lead acid battery is what is called the SLI, starting, lighting, and ignition. That's a lead acid battery. So as many of the discoveries, as many of the claims in the world, everybody's chasing this, not only for R&D money, but for, awards and all that sort of stuff. The lead acid battery, folks, over 150 years ago is still here. Does that tell you something?
Yeah. Well, and Nick, I was reading the research on fuel cells. That's been around forever too, right?
Yeah, I'll go over that on the fuel cell, right. So
Yeah.
then on the next battery is a NiCad battery. That's a rechargeable battery developed in the 40s and 50s. That's still around. The
Yeah.
problem there, it has a memory, so you don't get the ability to use the full battery capacity, and there
Yeah.
is the cadmium, which is toxic.
Yeah.
Then there was the nickel hydrogen battery. You're going to have to show your NASA shirt again.
Oh, there it is.
There you go. NASA used the nickel hydrogen as a gas
Yeah.
battery in spacecraft. Okay, so that's been around for quite some time. And then, drum roll, the nickel became the nickel metal hydride battery. So the
Yeah.
hydrogen there is stored as a metal hydride or in the solid form,
Yeah.
not gaseous, solid form. And
Mm.
that's where I've had my massive exposure. That was invented by Stanford Ovshinsky. And you folks in the audience might want to take that name down. There's a
Yeah.
recent biography of Stan. It's called The Man Who Saw Tomorrow by Lillian Hoddeson, Hoddeson, MIT Press. This
Okay.
this guy is he's passed away now. He is the modern day Thomas Edison. He
Okay.
is in the National Inventors Hall of Fame for the invention of the nickel metal hydride battery.
Okay.
Okay, still very, very big. That's nickel metal hydride in the world. Still in the Toyota Prius by Toyota.
Yeah.
Uh, the Toyota Corolla hybrid also uses the nickel metal hydride,
Yeah.
as the Toyota Mirai fuel cell car. So
Yeah.
it's a very, very prevalent battery in today's modern world. Now, of course, um, uh, I have been fortunate. I'll go to lithium in just a second. I was very fortunate years ago driving in a Toyota Prius with Mr. Ovshinsky and Robert Stempel on the expressways of Detroit 75. This
Yeah.
was a stock Toyota Prius that was burning hydrogen in its internal combustion engine. Now, think
Yeah.
of that, folks.
Yeah. So I don't think a lot of people realize. So what you're saying is this engine, they were piping hydrogen into the
Hydrogen into the engine that
Yeah.
was being burnt. There were 5 people in the car.
Yeah.
The transition from electric to the internal combustion engine was, you couldn't perceive it. And it
Yeah.
was a stock, I repeat, it was a stock, off the shelf Toyota Prius hybrid, gas
Yeah.
electric hybrid that was adapted for hydrogen instead of gasoline. That
Yeah.
was 20 years ago.
So let me pause real quick. So I know some of the audience members, I was kind of surprised, and Van, maybe you were too, but Toyota, Hyundai, and Honda all have vehicles, mostly in California, that are fuel cells, but they're
Right.
different from what Nick just talked about, which is the hydrogen. They were burning hydrogen in the engine itself. But talk to us a little bit about the Toyota Mirai, the Hyundai, and the Honda. I think those have, you go to a station and there's a nozzle and it's hydrogen going
Correct.
into the tank, right? So they've
Correct.
already processed the hydrogen, and
Right.
it's in the tanks at the gas station, and you plug it in and it goes into a tank. So there's an onboard fuel cell so you feed it with hydrogen while you're driving, and it's converting and creating electricity on the fly. Okay,
Right.
so it's not stored necessarily. There's a conversion process going on while you're driving. Is that
Right.
correct?
It is stored in a tank, in a
Yeah.
crash-proof tank. Okay.
But while you're driving, that fuel cell is creating the electrons, and that's
Correct.
feeding the electric motor.
Correct. It's electronic control that either goes into the battery or goes into the electric motor, depending
Okay.
upon where the demand is.
So
And
can
yes,
I ask you, is there the Nikola, the trucks,
correct.
is that a similar where they drive up to a station and fill with
Correct.
hydrogen?
And I'll go over Nikola in just a second.
Okay.
But to take off on that point, yes, there are hydrogen filling stations, several of them in California, not enough. They
Yeah.
developed what is called the hydrogen highway years ago. And most of those are under the control of Shell.
Okay.
So the hydrogen pumps are at the Shell gas stations, okay?
Yeah.
And there are several of them in Silicon Valley. And there's also a few hydrogen pumps on the East Coast, primarily in the state of Massachusetts.
Gotcha.
But that is the Achilles heel of hydrogen right now. The infrastructure is being built out as we speak to supply the filling stations to fill hydrogen. But before I go there, I have to go over one very, very important battery, and that's the lithium ion battery. Okay.
Yeah.
And everybody sees lithium ion in their cell phones, in their portable speakers. I mean, ad nauseum in their computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are about 20 plus chemistries in lithium ion batteries. One very prevalent one is the lithium ion phosphate. And of course, that's the big workhorse now of pure electric vehicles. They all use, if it's purely electric and purely battery, they all use lithium ion batteries because it stores the most energy per weight and volume for a battery. Okay. And just so as I stated, Ovshinsky for the nickel metal hydride is the inventor, and he is in the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And the inventor of the lithium ion battery is John Goodenough. He's 96 years old, and he's still working to improve the energy density of the lithium ion battery. He just received last year the Nobel Prize for the invention on chemistry for the invention of the lithium ion battery. So batteries have a big place in our lives, as everybody listening knows, number one. And number two, it's going to grow geometrically as you see more and more and more and more electric vehicles, gasoline electric vehicles, gasoline hybrid, electric trucks, and yes, even fuel cell electric vehicles, because a fuel cell, as you showed, thank you for the demonstration, a fuel cell vehicle also has a battery to get it started.
Right. Yep.
And also it does another function. They use am I going too confusing here, folks?
We may have to kind of change direction a little bit, but
okay.
But yeah,
right. I'll get, but it also uses the battery for what is called regenerative braking. They use the inertia of the electric motor. They change the polarity, and then that brings electricity back in, or electrons back into the battery. So
Nick, we got one kind of fun comment. One day we can have an engine motor like Dr. Emmett DeLorean that works with trash, garbage, waste. That would be great if we could take waste. And you know what's interesting? Aren't there cars right now that are using reclaimed oil?
Right. They're burning that through an internal combustion engine. Correct.
Okay, so they're taking the reclaimed oil from restaurants and trying to reuse that. So that's
let me just finish up batteries here. So there are other batteries out there that didn't quite work out too well. Zinc Air is one of them, rechargeable battery. You'll find there's predominantly in hearing aids. One of the electrodes is open to the air, and that's the problem. Everything changes in the air, the humidity, the temperature. The other one is the aluminum air. That didn't do much well. And you've got to be very careful, folks, out there. There's always claims, eternal claims of the ultimate battery, all right? So we started the battery company 35 years ago to manufacture, which we still do, the nickel metal hydride. But also we work very closely with lithium ion by the demands of the market. But you will find in the business side of the equation, not the science side of the equation, battery salesmen are infamous, and we always use this phrase. There's liars, there's damn liars, and there's battery salesmen.
Yeah.
Okay, they're always there.
Yep. No, that's a great journey through so batteries, the different types, and you get kind of brings us to today. So batteries have been around forever. Fuel cells have been around, invented a long time ago, and now are kind of being tested some more. You mentioned Toyota, Hyundai, and Honda. I think you also mentioned yesterday when we discussed there's a Toyota, is it a fork truck that uses?
Can you there's a Toyota. Toyota is the largest maker in the world of electric fork trucks. Okay.
Yeah.
They use the direct methanol fuel cell to recharge the battery bank that runs the forklift. So these forklifts, you don't put on a charging rack to go into the grid to charge them with electricity.
Yeah.
You pour into a container methanol. The methanol runs through the direct methanol fuel cell and charges the battery. So that's a very unique aspect of, and that's really the only fuel of a fuel cell that's in the liquid form.
Interesting. So yeah, I wanted you to mention that because I think a lot of our audience members, well, me in particular, I don't know, Van, if you've heard of some of these, but we didn't realize fuel cell was so, prevalent, and there were cars on the road and trucks and fork trucks. And I've heard there's a couple locations in California, and Microsoft now is testing fuel cells for some of their buildings, the larger buildings. But I wanted to bring up some of the other applications. So you mentioned, and when we started this talk, Nikola is doing a truck application. Bloom Energy, Plug Power, Toyota, Orja, you were mentioning. But let's go to Nikola real quick.
Okay, well, before we go there, let me go over the different kinds of fuel cells, okay?
Oh, yeah, yep.
And a fuel cell needs fuel. A fuel cell does not store electricity, okay?
Yeah.
Let's keep that point clear. You have to feed it a fuel.
Yeah.
There's no moving parts and there's no storage. Fuel cells have been around for, as you said, Charles, for many, many years. You ready for this one? It's been discovered by William Grove in 1839.
Yeah.
So the fuel cell was discovered before Planck discovered the rechargeable lead acid battery. 1839. Then Francis Bacon developed the alkaline fuel cell in 1932. This, like I said before, the power for spacecraft, along with solar cells, and only one nuclear, that's the Cassini probe. The power for spacecraft were fuel cells and hydrogen fuel cells and solar cells. They've been in the background for vehicles for many, many, many years. Every major car company has been working with fuel cells to develop fuel cells for many, many, many years, 30, 35, 40 years, okay? But they've been in the background. They haven't really talked about it too much. The car companies love Elon Musk taking all the oxygen out of the room on his Tesla pure battery electric car, because that gets the attention away from them, because they don't want their competition. No, Charles, you've been in the auto industry. You know how they are. Yeah. They don't want anybody knowing what the next generation is going to be. So it was great that Elon Musk took the attention away from the fuels, from the car companies, both major and not major, but they loved it because they were still back in the labs working.
Yeah.
This now is so they didn't want anybody knowing what they're doing, but this is about ready to change right now, 2020. I'll talk a little bit more about Nikola, Toyota, and Cummins, the famous diesel manufacturer in Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Indiana. Excuse me. Sorry.
And before we go, so you mentioned, did you go through the different types?
Yeah, I'm just going there now.
Okay.
I'm just going there.
What I found interesting too is when we talked about it yesterday, how important the hydrogen from electrolysis is, because it's very close to pure, what you were saying.
Right.
The other methods, there could be soiling and mixture of other impurities, whereas the electrolysis gives you the pure hydrogen, which, I think most people, when they think of fuel cells, when they think of hydrogen, think of electrolysis and the hydrogen from that, because it's more prevalent. So I just want to point that out before we get into it. But yeah, go ahead and
So now here are the different types of fuel cells. It converts fuel into some heat, some convert into lots of heat, plus electricity with no moving parts. And there's two types of fuel cells: transportation fuel cells or traction fuel cells, and stationary fuel cells, something that doesn't move. A fuel cell for a building, a cell phone tower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's two types of fuel cells. There's low heat fuel cells and there's high heat fuel cells. The low heat fuel cells are the hydrogen fuel cell or the proton exchange membrane fuel cell. Examples of this are Plug Power and Ballard. Ballard is out of Canada.
Yeah.
Now, they take pure hydrogen either from electrolysis of water, or they have a reformer that appears before the fuel cell. The reformer splits the hydrogen from the hydrocarbon, which is predominantly methane, CH4.
Yeah.
Again, as I mentioned, there is the direct methanol fuel cell. Methanol is the simplest alcohol of methane. Methane is CH4. Methanol is CH3OH. So it's a simple alcohol. And that's the direct methanol fuel cell, which is a variant of the proton exchange membrane fuel cell. And there's the alkaline fuel cell. Those are all low heat. The high heat fuel cells are the solid oxide fuel cell, which is fed methane or CH4. Westinghouse was doing a lot of research in that. I visited years ago their research facility in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They were still working on it. They were having problems. We can go through the problems a little later. The one in today's world is Bloom Energy out of California, and they also have the solid oxide fuel cell. The second fuel cell, these are high temperature fuel cells, so they create a lot of heat, and the heat that they create reforms the hydrocarbon, takes the hydrogen off and from the carbon and expels the carbon. So the molten carbonate fuel cell is fuel cell energy. And there's also the phosphoric acid fuel cell, which I'm not very familiar with. The molten carbonate fuel cell is the fuel cell energy fuel cell out of Danbury, Connecticut. I have also visited their plant in Danbury, Connecticut several times, as I have visited the Plug Power plant, that's the low temperature, and they're in Latham, New York. There are other companies with fuel cells. As I mentioned, Cummins now, about a year and a half ago, bought a company in Canada called Hydrogenics. That's the proton exchange membrane fuel cell. They also have electrolysis units. So that fuel cell will work off of pure, renewable hydrogen because it's coming from water. So that's called green hydrogen. And the Nikola trucks, that has a joint venture now, many, many joint ventures. General Motors, Honda's fuel cell, General Motors, LG Chemical battery. And so that brings in a lot, but they're also partnered with Bosch, which is the German electronics company, which has a fuel cell, which they manufacture in concert with the Swedish company PowerCell AB. So there's a lot of players in this field.
Right.
So the battery fuel cell competition controversy raises on, and there's no resolution to this particular. There'll be many players in the field, is what I'm saying. There will be pure electric cars.
I think you've you spelled out a lot of players. It sounds like there are a lot of players, but I want to take it from the perspective. So not a lot of people have been in depth like you have. And Van, for example, may have some questions. So
sure, I'm ready. I'm done with my.
Yeah. No, this is a good introduction, and let's get into the meaty stuff. So sure. Van, I'm going to ask one that I get a lot about fuel cells. Why isn't it more prevalent? When can we start using it? Right. So one of the things I can think of is infrastructure. Everybody's got a cable coming to their house with electricity being delivered. Gas stations. There's gas stations on every corner in the U.S. But hydrogen. I think you mentioned earlier. There's maybe 30 stations in California. There's a highway. Right. But what I want to comment on, what's really interesting, is Nikola's strategy, which is for trucks, right? So for trucks, if you do the fueling stations because they're not in the infrastructure business, neither is Toyota, neither is Honda or Hyundai. But if you go into trucks, then you limit your stations to kind of the trucking stations, the fueling stations. So you can build a smaller infrastructure. And I also read that one of the interesting things about that is the lithium ion batteries. The number of batteries you would have to take up to do these long hauls would take up capacity of storage inside that container that's on the back of the semi. So with a fuel cell, potentially you can reclaim some of that, and the total cost of operation could go down for the rig drivers. They could, I think Nikola was looking at the total cost of operation,
Correct.
and they increase it back. So I think a lot of people don't realize that is for the trucking industry, it makes more sense, especially in these early stages, whereas on the car industry, the personal cars, it may not make a lot of sense yet, but as the technology improves, it may move a little bit further. So maybe we'll talk about that. And then Van, like in terms of infrastructure, where do you see other, inroads in terms of fuel cells? You mentioned Toyota with the fork trucks. So maybe smaller, self-contained vehicles. But in terms of trucking, what makes sense for trucking? Do you have further insights? And also, what other industries? And Van, you're chatting here. In terms of adoption, what's needed for adoption, and the future of fuel cells. Okay, so that's our main topic. Is like, what's the future of fuel cells? So trucking is an interesting one. Why does it make sense for trucking? And then, what other industries do you see that may be able to adopt fuel cells first instead of personal vehicles?
Shall I take that?
What's that?
You want me to take that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay. All right. You bring up an interesting number. How many gas stations are there in the United States? The last time I checked, I didn't check this recently, but there's so give me a range here. There's 250,000. It's a big number. 250,000 to 300,000 gas stations in the United States.
Yeah.
Contemplate that number for a second. That's a big number. Yeah. All right.
That's a lot of fuel stations, hydrogen stations to put in.
Right. Like I say, Shell is the most prevalent in the United States, and there's not a lot. There's about 30 or 40 hydrogen filling stations at the Shell gas stations. Okay. Yeah. So there's not a lot. They are building them out. And like I say, on the East Coast, I think has a half a dozen. I think one is in Washington, D.C., one or two, and most of them, 3, 4, 5, or 6, whatever, in Boston. Now, to go back to the infrastructure, first of all, a battery heavy-duty, on-road heavy-duty truck. They make their money by how much cargo they can haul, okay? Yep. So if you want to haul around a lot of batteries to drive the truck, it doesn't, and batteries are heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy. And if you're going to run an 18-wheeler, you're going to have a lot of batteries. Yeah. And here's a little thought. The weight of the batteries fully charged and the weight of the batteries fully discharged isn't very different. So at the end of the charge cycle, or the end of how much is left, you're still carrying around all this dead weight that isn't doing anything.
Oh, man.
It's just sitting there.
My gosh. And I was just watching a video yesterday. So there's a lot of weight limits on roads.
Absolutely.
Now you got to think about, well, if I got too many batteries on, I'm going to go over my weight limit, and it takes away that capacity too.
Whereas if you carry hydrogen, and everybody's all going to be upset because hydrogen is explosive. Yes, it's number one in the periodic chart of the atom. All right. Yeah. It's the most prevalent in the universe, but it is explosive. Yes. However, everybody thinks of the Hindenburg blowing up with the hydrogen dirigible that it was. That was 1933. Yeah. Now, I asked the audience, has there been any progress in material science, A, or B, in sensing science and computers? C. Yeah. B and C, all right? Of course there has been. So the tanks that carry either natural gas for vehicles. There are natural gas vehicles, but natural gas doesn't have a whole lot of punch to it.
Yeah.
So the vehicles that are and will be carrying hydrogen are in triple layer, multi-sensored, multi-tested destructive testing tanks.
Yeah.
They're fiberglass, they're carbon fiber, and there's plastic linings. Okay.
Yeah.
So these tanks are engineered with all the material science of today's world.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's escape valves, there's sensors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And when there is a hydrogen leak, hydrogen goes, being the lightest element there is, it goes in one direction,
Yeah.
straight up. When there's a leak in a gas tank, it's heavier than air and it circles the vehicle. So the old classic, being in medicine, when they'd bring a burn victim in to the ER, we'd come in a lot of times to intubate them. The phraseology was, we got them out before the explosion or the fire started with the gasoline or diesel.
Yeah.
Some a little fact people don't really appreciate too much.
Right. Oh.
So these tanks are highly, highly tested over and over and over again. They're made by multiple companies. Toyota has their own factory that makes the tanks for their fuel cell cars, tested extensively, again, multi-layered. Cummins has a 50-50 joint venture with a German company called Naprox, NPROXX.
Yeah.
And they make their business is making hydrogen storage tanks.
Oh, so there's companies.
Natural gas source. So these companies that have been back in the weeds now that nobody really hears a whole lot about, again, because of the showman, and he is a showman. He's done an awful lot. I'm not criticizing him, but as he's taken all the attention, these companies haven't fallen asleep. They are preparing for the hydrogen economy.
Yeah.
And Nikola is another one of those. So now you've got the 260 gas stations in the United States. Not very, very, very few of those have a hydrogen pump, but that's changing, number one. And Nikola, that's the joint venture with General Motors, Bosch, Power Cell, Nel, the electrolysis company, Hanwha Q, the solar company, and I'll go over that in just a second. They have three legs of their stool. Okay. Number one leg was getting the orders. They have a massive order of 800 trucks from Anheuser-Busch.
Yeah.
Their second massive order was 2,500, expanding to 5,000 from not waste management, but Republic Waste, which is the second largest waste hauler in the United States.
Yeah.
And the third leg, so they've got the orders, they've got the second leg, was another manufacturing partnership to add to all the ones that they have. They have two auto truck manufacturers. One is Iveco out of Germany. Well, it's an Italian, American, Dutch conglomerate, about 60,000 employees. It's quite large. They have a truck factory in Germany.
Yeah.
Their Iveco trucks that is making the Toyota 18-wheeler as we speak.
Yeah.
That will then expand. Nikola's putting up their factory in Arizona.
Well, what about so we've talked a lot about automotive, we've talked a lot about trucking, but one area, kind of along to Van's point is, are there other industries? And what I saw in the news that was interesting was the data centers. Azure, Microsoft is starting to test, and that was an interesting one to me because it's not a lot of people want to be the first ones to put hydrogen in the back of their car. And I noticed the cost of a hydrogen car is still like 60,000. They don't have the volumes yet, on the station. So you're looking at a Tesla, that I think there's 40K. You got a $60,000, hydrogen fuel cell car, and all the stations are in California. So that doesn't make sense yet. Trucking makes a little more sense because of the weight, the capacity. But what I'm interested in is kind of the other industries that maybe are moving forward with this, right? The data centers, big consumers of energy. You can't have any downtime. You can't rely on that grid potentially. What are the other benefits of the stationary markets?
Let me finish the third leg of Nikola. So they've got the two legs now, especially the second leg was with General Motors to add to their partnerships. The third leg is their fueling stations. Now they haven't announced that yet, but they will be setting up fueling stations all throughout the United States, primarily in the large interstates where trucks travel extensively, like Route 80, bisecting the United States. So they haven't named their partners yet, but there's several in the mix, and I am not privy to who they are, but there'll be several people vying for that position. So Nikola will be setting up their infrastructure of fueling. So now back to your question. But yes, there are many, many other uses. Data centers 24/7, 365, uninterruptible power. Why? Because everybody goes, the information's got to flow. Data centers classically consume an enormous amount of energy, basically for cooling, because I've been in several data centers, they call them meat lockers.
Yeah.
Because they keep their temperature about 55 degrees. That is, Charles, now you're more on the engineering side than I am. That's to keep the chips, the DRAM chips, the memory chips cool enough so they work. So these data centers consume an enormous amount of energy with electricity to run the data centers, but to keep them cool. They consume a lot of energy. So yes, they are several companies, Google, Microsoft, and several of their Apple, their plants that use and their data centers use fuel cells. There's another very big application, and that's cell phone towers. There's another aspect that has to work 24/7, 365. So they are plugged into the grid, yes, but as we all know, and as we all have been disappointed more than once, the grid fails for whatever reason. Wildfires in California, hurricanes on the East Coast, tornadoes, hurricanes in the Midwest, hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, drunks hitting a power pole, squirrels. There's just so many ways to bring the grid down.
Right.
The deer hunters in Michigan, they used to shoot out this when they weren't catching any. They didn't see any deer. They'd shoot out the insulators in the power lines. You don't think that's real? That's very. Do you
I
hunt?
know it's real. I mean, I don't.
So the 24/7, 365 cell phone towers are either hooked into the grid, or they're redundant, just like the data centers, or they have a bank of batteries, or they have fuel cells.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's infrastructure. You need the data redundancy. You need the power to stay on. That's an interesting application. So, Nick, we're at 53 minutes.
Okay.
So we're gonna have to wrap up. But I wanted to just ask you a question. So if you were talking to somebody that's new, like Van or me, and you think back 10, 15 years ago, what's the best way to just learn as quickly as possible or get into fuel cell technology? What were some good resources for you? How would you guide somebody that was younger into this kind of new futuristic industry?
Sure. A, the internet. How can you beat the internet as far as information? B, books. Obviously, books are always valuable. C, I also consult with a financial firm in Grand Rapids on energy. And, remember Willie? He was the bank robber. Willie, I can't remember his last name. Not Willie Nelson, but anyway, he used to rob banks. And they'd always ask him, Willie, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Okay. Well, the money is the stock market. Okay. So you might want to start following the stock. I didn't say invest in any stocks. I didn't say that.
Right.
But some of the names we mentioned, watch what they do, watch what their progress or lack of progress or their negative progress, like Plug Power, like Nikola, like Tesla, like Bloom Energy, like
Yeah.
Cummins. These are all very active stocks that are in this space big time. And
Yeah.
again,
No, yeah.
money has a tendency to follow what's hot.
Oh, I like it. So that's a really interesting strategy. I don't think I've thought about it that way before, but yeah, the stock market, people invest in companies they're interested in, and then if you follow the companies and watch their trends and research those companies, you can learn about where the money is flowing, and you kind of follow the money in terms of where it's flowing. So no, great advice for I think Van. Did you have any more questions for Nick before we leave here, or?
Oh, well, and thank you for Nick for all the insights into
You're welcome.
battery and fuel cells. So I think the audience will be interested to know, like, so the fuel cell has a lot of benefits on the earth, right, and the human life. So what should we do to adopt the fuel cell, like to prepare to adopt the fuel cell better in the future?
The best thing that the general public can do by taking again, you have to realize there's always in life, everything, there's always a risk. It's a risk reward ratio. Okay. So there are going to be people out there, a lot of people out there, I'm sure, have bought electric cars. There will be people out there that buy hydrogen fuel cell cars. They're taking a risk right now because the infrastructure isn't there, but it is developing. So people can buy fuel cell cars. There's a whole host of them, but wait a little bit because the infrastructure is forming. And if you're going to look anywhere, look to Shell because they will probably fill that void quicker and faster than anybody else.
I just want to, before we end, Nick, one thing we talked about yesterday that was really interesting from our other call was, the price of power in each state or even within regions of a state depends on proximity to the type of power plant that you're close to. I think you said, right? If you're closer to coal, cheaper. If you're closer to other types, potentially higher costs. And then the supply fluctuates too. I remember seeing a map once where the price of energy around a certain area was very, very low. They had a heat map, and I asked what was going on in that area, and they're like, "Oh, there's a wind farm right there." So it was a very windy day in that region, and there was a wind farm, and then the supply jumped up, and so the supply was so high that the price dropped just in that area, and to transport it out, it would cost so much. So as you got away from that concentration of energy, you saw the heat map show that the price got higher and higher, right? Which was fascinating for me. But that leads me to a question that people ask me a lot about fuel cells and electric vehicles is, well, isn't it just coal? You isn't your electric car, you charge it with electricity, but doesn't it come from a coal plant? And I was watching a video, and I think you can comment on this, but it depends on your location. Because if you're in California, I think they were saying, up to 40% of the energy there, electricity there, is from renewables. But if you go to a state like West Virginia, potentially, where their economy is still based on coal, close to 100% is still coal-based energy. So the electric vehicle, based on where you get that power from, the charge from, could be from a bunch of different sources of where that energy came from, right?
Yes. And again, there's a concept there of, using like I did with the Willie, where'd you hide the money? Or Willie, why do you rob banks? There's also the concept of support your local sheriff. West Virginia, Kentucky, areas of Ohio, they have coal mines. A lot of these people work in the coal industry. Okay. So they're going to support their local sheriff because the coal burners are there, the fuel is there. And then you go to California, they have a lot of renewable energy, like you say. But when you look at the whole concept of this United States and how is the power created, about 30 to 35% is still coal. It was in the 60%, but it's dropped drastically. And it's not due to renewables.
Yeah.
It's due to natural gas, industrial gas turbines. Okay. And they account for about 45 to 50%. And these numbers may be off a little bit, but they're basic approximate numbers. About 15 to 20% is still nuke, and about less than 10%, about 8 to 10%, a little less than 10% of the United States is renewable energy.
Interesting. So there's the new power plant in Holland.
Correct.
And the old one was coal. The new one is natural
gas turbines, right?
Interesting. Okay. So a lot of that's a transition. And you were saying overall US about 40 to 45% is natural gas now?
About 45 to 50%. 50%. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if the numbers are adding up. So there are ranges here, and I don't have them memorized, and it's changing all the time. But the coal conversion is predominantly natural gas turbines.
Interesting.
General Electric, Siemens gas turbines, right?
Interesting. No, that's I'm glad I brought that point up. I almost forgot to bring it up, but
to just confirm that natural gas is very, very, very cheap. The United States has some of the most prevalent natural gas in the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. Nick, fascinating stuff as always. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us and the audience. Van, thanks for being on this call. This is your first live show with us. So thanks for coming on. And then, Nick, I think I'm going to repost this one. We'll probably get more questions. And we may have to do a follow-up because...
Oh, yeah, this is a complicated field. And I covered a lot of territory. And there's subtleties I didn't even mention.
Yeah. So I'm going to query my audience, see what the questions are, and then we're going to revisit and come back. So thanks, everybody, for watching. Juan, actually, who made the comment is in Peru, I believe. So he was commenting from Peru. So we had one audience member international today. So if you could hang on just a second, and both of you, we'll do a recap of everything. And then if other people are in the audience right now, I'm going to repost this on YouTube. I think it's going to go right to YouTube. So subscribe to my channel. And we're going to do a lot more energy because it's fascinating for me. I think the last thing I'll mention is my dad worked at Nikola and Chevron. And, when I asked him when I was young, should I become a geologist just like you? And he said, no, Charles, solar, fuel cells, these are future looking. These are the exciting ones. And he wouldn't let me, get into geology because he's like, you got to research this stuff. So I'm so excited, Nick, that you could come and talk to us, and kind of feed my curiosity here. So thanks, everyone. So we're going to...
Publicly, I want to thank you, Charles, very much. And Van, I want to thank you. And just one last comment, and I'll keep my mouth shut here. Peru, what solar insulation or sunlight and water are ubiquitous worldwide.
Yeah, that's
leave with that.
Yep. All right. Thanks. And hold on one second. Yep. Thanks. Bye.